Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today we have a special guest, Joey Wilhelm from Pinwheel, joining us. Thanks, Joey, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Joey's a security engineer at Pinwheel, and I'm super excited to have him talk to us today because Pinwheel is one of our very first customers at Phylum, and we're really excited to see how they've developed in using our product, and excited to talk to Joey. Joey, tell me a little bit about how you got started in security. I love this kind of line of questioning where everyone kind of has these typical interesting paths and how they got started. So what was yours?
I would say mine is a little atypical. I kind of stumbled into security. Really, it wasn't an intentional thing. I started with computers a long time ago, and when I was getting started in this career path, it was really I was in charge of everything. It wasn't these entire companies of engineers. It was
Right.
one person running everything from the hardware all the way up to what's rendering in a browser. So became very familiar with security there, and just over the course of a few jobs, that experience really played out and came to bear that that experience meant I was able to sit in this function and really able to speak to it.
Yeah, it's I'm a bit nostalgic for those years, to be honest. Like I look back at times when software ran on metal and you could attach a debugger to something and you could step an instruction counter and you could see what was happening. And now with a lot of the advancements, like there's dozens of levels in between the metal and what's actually getting executed. And yeah, nostalgically, I look back in that a bit and say I kind of miss those times. But it does give you like that really broad range of background. That's something I always kind of see in a lot of the people in our industry is there's some software dev typically, there's some networking understanding, there's operating systems, there's how web software works. It's really complex. But what would you say your favorite part, if you had to pick one favorite part of that gigantic mess of skills we all had to kind of build, what's your favorite thing to do?
Really, my favorite thing is building tools that are widely applicable, things that impact an entire organization, or that I'm able to share out and help more people with. More so than more so than just like working on a user interface or managing a database. It's that wide applicability.
Very cool. Um, as I mentioned, so Pinwheel is one of our very first customers at Phylum, and um, one of the things I was curious about is like, how would you describe use Phylum in your AppSec program today? Like, where does it fit in? What is it doing for you?
We we've actually started to rely pretty heavily upon it. Right now, we've got it to the point where every bit of code that's checked in has to be scanned by Phylum across all of our projects, all of our repositories, and it's a hard requirement. So if the Phylum check fails, if it finds any kind of vulnerability, uh, that's a hard stop. Um,
That's
so it's
interesting.
become
A complicated thing to integrate into CI/CD and like block developer workflows, but yeah, that's awesome to hear that you're seeing the value across all those different repositories you guys manage.
it's great, and it has helped in a way change mindsets or help grow mindsets and bring visibility, because you can fall into this space, especially in a fast growing startup. You're just building feature after feature after feature.
Right.
You often don't have that time or even think to look back and say, hey, maybe I should update some things. Or you may not have all the time or the experience to go vet a new dependency that you're adding, or look all the way down the dependency chain. So Phylum's been extremely valuable in bringing light to all of that.
Oh, that's great to hear. Um, I understand you've really developed some interaction with Brad Crawford, our VP of product, and I know Brad is always asking customers for feedback and ideas and what they like, what they don't like, and tell me how that's gone for you.
That's been fantastic. It's nice to have that sort of inside track. Anytime I run into something that seems a little weird, or just think, hey, I wonder if we can do this, or wonder if they're thinking about this. I'll just, I'll just go ping him, and he's always, like you said, he loves receiving that feedback. He's very receptive. So I've even been able to see, like, mock-ups of things that are in the works and give feedback on that. Say, well, maybe if it worked a little more like this, explain how we would use it. It's been great. Kind of feels like having a stake in the future direction of the product.
That's awesome. It's been a huge improvement, especially from the days of when there was a few of us just kind of like mocking up ideas on a whiteboard and then saying, go build that thing. And it was just, it's the early stages of a startup or a product startup. You're trying to build features. You're trying to do it rapidly. You're trying to make something useful for customers. But when Brad really kind of came in and put some more structure around it, it's been really helpful for us. And it's glad to hear it's, you see it on the customer side as well. So jumping back a little bit, I know you said, in our earlier conversations, you chatted about kind of some of your experience with like large organizations and in large enterprises. And how do you see the difference with that, with working at a more kind of earlier startup with Pinwheel, and, any changes or things you like in one area or the other?
It is a very different world. It's interesting. At Pinwheel, the red tape almost doesn't exist. Turning on Phylum as a as a showstopper, for example, that was just something I said, hey, I'm going to turn this on. People said, okay, and that was that. At a larger organization, that would be, months of reviews and approvals going all the way up through the chain. And it may have never even happened.
Right.
And that's for a vital tool. What I view as something that's become absolutely vital. So for something that's not vital, good luck.
Yeah. Does it ever get done? Right. And
right.
Yeah, I've definitely spent some time at some large orgs in kind of more of a consulting or advisory capacity, but it was disheartening to me to see how slow and kind of complicated it was to get some things done. Whereas, if you get the right people in alignment and say, this needs to happen, let's go do it, move on to the next thing. That only really works in smaller orgs. So maybe that's probably where I should stay. But
it definitely seems like, and I can't say this universally, but it does seem like the more an organization grows, the more the momentum slows. And in some ways it has to.
Yeah, I could see that. What do you think? Like if you got to kind of like paint the world the way you wanted it to, what could orgs do to move faster? Like, what do you see? Like, what are the blockers that shouldn't be there, that if you could kind of just say, we're going to pull these out? What's your perspective on that?
Really, the biggest thing I would say that I've seen is you hire a person to do a very specific job. You hire them for their expertise, and then put all these roadblocks in their path. You have to get all these approvals for everything. Just trust people's expertise. You hired them for a reason. They've already proven themselves. Trust them. And that's essentially what's happening here at Pinwheel, and why things are able to move so quickly is we have to trust each other. We have to trust that we're going to continue moving quickly and continue working toward the betterment of the company. And I think that only serves to improve our velocity and improve our momentum.
The trust bit is really interesting, especially being in a small startup where we're, really trying to build features as fast as possible, but also be very security conscious. That trust thing really rings true. You have to hire the right people and you have to enable them as much as possible. And yeah, I think it also it reminds me of some orgs I've worked with in the past where there's a lot of middle management, and sometimes maybe they're trying to validate their reason for existence. Not pointing any fingers, but I think I definitely like it a little bit better on the smaller side. So switching gears over to open source. I know you're an open source developer, and first, to the open source community, especially talking to someone that contributes. Thank you for that work.
It's my pleasure.
I'm always curious from the perspective of, how I see it, beleaguered by being a security researcher since I was a kid. I can't not see it that way. What are the things that keep you up at night about open source security? What worries you?
It's interesting. Open source, it seems like in a way has become a victim of its own success. In the early days of open sourcing, I started using Linux way back. I think the kernel was still, might have been version 1, version 2 was, being talked about.
Yeah.
Back then, it was people who were passionate about building these things, passionate about sharing. And that passion and that want to contribute imbued trust. I'm going back to this concept of trust.
Yeah.
But also as a user, you had to have some knowledge of it. You recognized the people involved. You had to manually build things. You had to apply patches.
Right.
So you had to have some knowledge of what was going on. So there was a lot of built-in insight there. So you really knew what was happening. You knew the players. Nowadays, the landscape has grown so much and it's become so easy to contribute, which is amazing. I love that it's so easy to contribute. But it's easy not only for the well-intentioned folk, but also for the bad actors.
You got it. Yep.
And that's the terrifying part. And then you have things like you add one dependency to a program, well, it's going to have a chain 10 levels deep, and it's going to end up adding, 5 gigs of dependencies, depending on the particular ecosystem you're looking at. And you have no idea what those are. You don't know who was writing them. You don't know what they're doing. You don't know if it's somebody who's going to pull it from the internet tomorrow, like we've seen happen.
Left pad.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
There's just so many unknowns nowadays.
Yeah, it's something you said, kind of like a victim of its success, kind of jumped, that really rang true for me. The, thinking back to smaller open source communities or smaller communities in general. And I think there was a little bit of element of this in some parts of security research for a bit as well, where there was kind of this like barrier to entry you needed to kind of get over in order to kind of be in that group. And not saying that was a intentional design. I think it was kind of more just an accidental thing, but it limited the amount of people and it made it easier to keep 100, 200 connections in your brain, right?
Right.
So it was a little bit easier to reference. And now, I'm sure you've seen us talk about the millions and millions of packages we analyze per quarter that are just released or updated by some username on some platform that's putting code somewhere that's getting shoved into computers, right? Like it's tough because I really like what you said, it's easy for anyone to contribute, but that means it's easy for anyone to contribite, including the bad.
Right, exactly. And those package repositories, when they first came out, they were an absolute blessing. Early days of Python packages, you go to SourceForge and you download a zip file and you manually install it. now it's pip install, poetry add, it's so much easier. But again, it's that catch of it's so much easier.
Yeah, and kind of um the expectation of I looked it up one time. It was something having to do with like the bystander effect, where like um it's something to do with like the theory of like if there's an accident on the side of the road, um people are less likely to pull over because they'll assume someone else will.
Mm,
And maybe that one side of it got kind of challenged, but there's another concept in open source of like, you know, with enough eyes, any bugs become shallow or something. I think it's like called Linus's law, but it's actually from ESR. Um, but the concept of, well, if this was bad, someone else would have found it, right?
right.
Maybe back in the day, but not at the volume of code that is coming out right now. It is like, A, it's staggering. B, the amount of developers that are coming in is exploding through things like boot camps. And then now with LLMs writing code, I mean, it's like we've jumped the shark. And yeah, the defense of that is going to be a fun game that I'm excited to be playing in, but I don't know what we do when LLMs start writing LLMs to generate more packages automatically. It's going to be there's going to be a
We'll
computer.
have we'll have no shortage of work, that's for sure.
Yeah, yeah. I guess it's not going anywhere, right? Like that's a good thing. Thinking about those kind of the changes from software development earlier on versus some of the new, seeing some new developers kind of come into the industry. What do you see? How do you think of the changes to AppSec and how we deal with that? Given that some software developers now may be doing like boot camps and may not have kind of some of the underpinnings of computer science that maybe some of the other people would have went through or spent the time to kind of go through, let's say. How do you see that affecting AppSec?
It's I think it's made it just all that much more critical. It's it's really pretty interesting. Like you said, at these boot camps, there's not necessarily that focus on security. There's not. And I remember when OWASP first formed back in 2001. And the first list of top vulnerabilities are coming out.
Yeah.
And that's context that these newer developers don't have. Even people who are getting comp sci degrees today, they're not going to have that historical context necessarily.
Yeah.
And so I feel like it's our job in AppSec not necessarily to just fix the problems, put tools in place to mitigate all these issues, but it's actually our job to educate and teach that context. Tell, not just say stop doing that, that's bad, but say here's why. Like here is what this can do, and here's a better way. Here's some study materials, for example. I really kind of view it being an AppSec, especially at a very rapidly moving startup. I view it more as program management than anything. I'm basically building a security program. I'm working to enhance the mindsets of our developers and get them thinking in a more secure manner. Get them thinking, if we're taking in this data, we need to treat it in this way. What not only what is the happy path of this code, but what could potentially go wrong with it? How could that be exploited?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of it used to security kind of used to sit as this final stage in AppSec, probably most particularly, but at the end of a given piece of software development, right? And then find issues or things that need to be corrected and then bring them back and then rush and everyone's kind of frustrated, right? But there's definitely value in kind of building that process in where you're it's less about, I always had this kind of bloodlust for bugs, right? Like you had to find, like, I have to find something. There's got to be something wrong with this. I can, like the hubris from that, right? And
Right.
part of that excitement of working for that kind of, looking for that kind of thing, when you find it, it gives you a dopamine hit, and you like that, and that's why someone may want to keep looking for bugs. But the change of, sure, find those things, but then don't just tell them about it, but like help them go understand the correction, and then maybe step back a little bit and say, how did we get to the spot where that was kind of introduced? Yeah, the collaborative aspect is definitely going to be important for AppSec and engineering teams kind of meld together better.
Right. And we've had I've encountered instances where we do have that case of security is looped in at the last minute, and oh, we need to demo this today or tomorrow, and by the way, we've got this giant implication. Whoa, hold on. And I think we're able to work past those, and we're able to make it happen, make it work. But then the important part there is closing the loop. Like, go back, have a retrospective around it, and say, okay, how did this happen? Why did this happen? Where did we miss? And so they're helping me learn, and then I'm able to in turn help them learn. And it's a virtuous cycle. And we're only improving, because, like you said, it used to be everything comes to security at the last minute. Security blocks everything, and it reinforces that classic combative stance between engineering and security. And it's really important to be able to move that earlier in the cycle and work together, because that's the only way you can maintain the velocity that's necessary at a company like this.
Yeah, it's that's something we had been thinking about at Phylum, and like also a little bit before that, but like how do we build something that kind of allows security to integrate more and get an earlier chance at finding something helpful or corrective potentially. And that was one thing that the advent of CI/CD pipelines and people relying so heavily on Git, which is not that old, right? Like, this is fairly kind of newish. But the idea that we could, formulate bits of code into small segments that are reviewable, and have an opportunity to kind of comment on that or review that while software development's happening, that's a relatively new thing if you look at the timeline. And it's awesome for security. And that was one thing we got excited about building a product is, the concept of where a pull request or a merge request lives gives you an opportunity to look at some contiguous piece of code and then intuit how that may integrate with an application. It may not be perfect. It may not be necessarily like a complete feature, complete element, but it does give us a chance to kind of integrate earlier. And then if we find something bad, correct earlier, which means the timelines don't get hit as much, and feels like we're making progress, steps forward. Maybe it doesn't feel that way all the time, but
absolutely. And I've even seen in our org, as time has passed since we put Phylum in place as a hard stop, like attitudes are changing, because initially it was difficult. We had a lot to work through. Like, I mean, we started it not as blocking, just as warning,
right,
and letting people know, hey, you need to take these seriously. But over time, there's fewer and fewer messages coming up, because it's changing people's approach. It's changing their mindsets. It's moving from, oh, we need to lock everything down to these specific versions, and we can't allow anything to update, which works great for getting something going. Absolutely, that's a valid way of starting something. But it's changed this mindset to let's proactively keep things up to date. Let's keep rolling forward. And suddenly, like, we don't have that many findings. And it's improving the security, it's improving the performance, it's giving us new features. It's having profound effects.
That's interesting. I mean, that was the idealized goal we were trying to going for. And obviously we're only working with open source dependencies, right? There's a big rat's nest of code that we have to deal with, but it's only one piece of an AppSec pipeline, right? But it's encouraging to hear that the behaviors that change have downstream positive effects on other aspects as well. And I always kind of like described that, there's this kind of adage that security tools are complex. That's why developers don't want to use them. They're hard to use, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Git, to me, is infinitely more complex than any security tool I've ever touched. I understand about 0.01% of it, but I can use it to do the things I need to do.
Right.
My theory is there's maybe 10 people on Earth that truly understand Git down to its cores, but millions of developers use it every day because they don't need to. They need to understand the gamification of using that thing to accomplish the thing they're trying to do. They do. They move forward. And the hope is to kind of continually build security tools into a position where maybe that adjustment can become less and less and less over time, but it's that gamification, kind of like Git, where I have to do things a little bit differently, but the outcomes are I get annoyed much less, and right. I have, there's less of these things I have to go fix later that are these security issues that pop up that I really don't want to deal with. So this is worth it. I'll make that modification, and now, there's like those downstream effects that come back from it. It's really encouraging and rewarding to hear that you've actually seen that in practice.
When it's talking about trying to decrease the annoyance and keep things moving faster like that. You had mentioned earlier, finding a bug was that dopamine hit for you. Now, like the green check mark becomes that dopamine hit for the developers. That's the goal. You want a green check mark that says it's all good. All right, good to go.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's not to get too philosophical, but life is you could boil it down to some versions of like avoiding the pain of the red check mark and getting the dopamine green, right? Like it's that's funny. So we were talking about open source, and I know you've done some open source development yourself, and you told me a little bit about Vulnbot, which I know you're putting together, and let's jump into that. Let's actually pull that up quick. Yeah, tell us about Vulnbot.
Sure. So Vulnbot, it was born out of a similar space as Phylum, actually. So before we started enforcing Phylum checks, we started using Dependabot, and that's GitHub's built-in dependency updater, and it will flag if you have CVEs and even offer pull requests. But the problem is, for one, it can be extremely noisy. There's a lot going on with it, and despite that noise, it can also be difficult to see where the findings are. Like, you have to actively log into GitHub. You have to go to the security tab. You have to go to Dependabot alerts, and then you finally get a list. If you have, if your org or your team has 50, 100 repos, that's just far too much to ask. So when I started configuring and pushing the use of Dependabot, our engineering managers came back and said, this is untenable. We need some better visibility into this. So I started noodling around a little bit and ended up coming up with the idea of Vulnbot. Basically started with pull the alerts down from GitHub's API, post them to Slack. come to today, it's grown a little bit more, at least conceptually, and it's to the point now it will actually report out to multiple different places. So it's reporting to Slack. It has a console reporter, working on an email reporter. Want to push to Datadog so you can see how you're trending. You
Yeah.
know, what projects, what teams are struggling the most with their updates. And we're actually going to work on multiple data sources as well. So hopefully, one of the things I've talked to Brad about is how can we integrate this with Phylum? Let's get not just CVEs, but let's get the actively malicious code reported out in here. That would be fantastic.
Absolutely. I mean, we have an API and we'd love to see that get integrated. That's awesome. And it's always neat when necessity is the, driver behind, or necessity or laziness is the driver behind a lot of innovation, right? I think there's two adages in that, but taking something, tweaking it, making it better, making it fit into how you need to use it, and then see if other people need something similar. That's like that's the game with open source, right? Like that's awesome.
Right. And that's definitely the hope here. Like I looked at this and said, well, clearly we're not the only ones that have this problem. I searched around and I found other projects that, they would post in Slack the moment an alert, Dependabot alert was opened, and that it left it at that. The difference here is that it is, you run Vulnbot, and every time you run it, it posts all of them. So we actually have it running internally. We have it running on a weekly schedule. So every week, Friday morning, we report out to all the teams, here's the status of all your open alerts for all of your repositories. So it's an ongoing thing instead of just, hey, this is open, and then forget about it.
Right. Yeah, you need that kind of you need that reminder context and what's changed from the last time. And it's a lot to keep going, a lot to keep in one's head as a software developer and that's where, notification systems can be so helpful.
Well, that's part of where the hope with a Datadog reporter is, or, if we can report out to other similar logging and visualization systems, report out to Elastic, for example.
Sure.
We can build those visualizations that, it goes back to the gamification you're talking about. Let's see if we can get those trending downward. What team is going to make the most progress? Have competitions about that even.
Yeah. That's cool. And I'm always, interested in who else is doing stuff in the open source package space, because that is an interesting set of challenges you run into when you try to work on some of those problems. We need more people working on it for sure.
Right. And it is a limited, limited contributor base for sure, but this is a problem that really every organization has.
Right.
Every organization has vulnerabilities. They all need visibility into that. How are they going to do that? So hopefully this can be something, others find use from.
Absolutely. I will post a link below the videos if you want to go check out Vulnbot and work with Joey on the automation.
Wonderful. Contributors are welcome.
Yeah. So Joey, thank you so much for joining. It's been a wonderful talking with you, and thanks so much for being an early user of Phylum and supporting us. I really appreciate you coming on to talk to me today, and thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. This has been great, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what more Phylum has to offer.
Awesome. All right. Thanks everyone for joining.